Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And thank you also to Aaliyah for inviting me to be part of the Green Drinks program for the Berkshire Environmental Action Team. And I'm going to apologize in advance. I have an extremely slow home internet connection, which I've been trying to resolve before tonight, and unfortunately it didn't happen. So we're going to do our best, and there might be a little bit of a delay with the slides. In any case, I know that we've all been having such a challenging year, so I'm grateful for this opportunity to spend time with all of you talking about, some of my favorite animals and my favorite habitats. And I actually very interested in your next green drinks, because this is all part of natural resource and sustainability and conservation. So I thought before we jumped into the formal presentation, to help us all get in the right frame of mind for this presentation, and also to give you a chance to share, as you might have done if you were at an in-person green drinks gathering, because this is kind of a weird new normal. I just thought it would be great if we all took a moment to think about the last amphibian, sorry, no snakes, amphibian encounter you had. So the last, say, frog, salamander, newt, or toad that you saw. And maybe if you want to take a minute, think about that, but then if you'd like, share it in the chat box, write down what you saw and maybe where, and that'll kind of give us a sense of where everybody's participating from also. In the meantime, I can tell you that for myself, along with hearing gray tree frogs in my yard all summer, my last encounter was about 10 days ago on a hike up Twin Mountain in the Catskills. I saw a newt, I saw a tiny American toad, and this is usually a good time of year to see small juvenile American toads. But I was really surprised up on the trail to see two green frogs hanging out in a flooded part of the trail. So, that's what I saw recently. And I can't see the chat box right now, but look forward to seeing what you wrote later on. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about where I come from. So the Hudson River Estuary program is a non-regulatory program within the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. We take an ecosystem-based approach, so we're kind of unique within the DEC, which normally focuses on regions of the state. We cross 3 different regions of the DEC because we're looking at the whole ecosystem. And so we look at, our program focuses on the tidal portion of the Hudson River, or the estuary, as well as the surrounding watershed, which is shown in green on the map, which I'm hoping is on your screen. And that watershed area includes all of the land and the water bodies that drain into the estuary, and that helps to keep this whole ecosystem functioning. And so that includes forests and wetlands like woodland pools, which we'll be talking about today. So again, I'm Laura Heady, and I'm the team leader for our conservation and land use team. And together with my colleagues, Ingrid Hakel and Nate Nardi-Cyrus, we work with municipalities and land trusts in the watershed to provide science-based training, data, planning tools, really with the ultimate goal of helping those partners conserve priority natural areas. And, New York State is a home rule state, and it's really, there's an opportunity at the local level to put into place conservation policies and plans to help kind of bridge the gap that maybe state protections don't provide. So it's really important to work with these local partners. I will give a little disclaimer. So I'm not a herpetologist. I haven't actually even had a herpetology class. I come at this work more from I have a master's in biology, but I come at the work more from conservation planning perspective, and getting partners to think about habitats, think about habitat connectivity, think about these important kind of lesser known habitats like woodland pools. And I also am from New York, so my familiarity with where you are, maybe in the Berkshires and Massachusetts, might be limited compared to what I know in New York. So you might need to do some research on some of these topics maybe after tonight. So that said, let's move on to talk about woodland pools. So what is a woodland pool? Forests and wetlands are 2 extremely important components of any watershed, no matter where you live. And so I'm going to take a deep dive into exploring woodland pools and what they might be called, or what you may have heard them called. So this is normally an animated slide, but I just wanted to give you a sense of some of the different terms. I mean, vernal pool, obviously you've probably heard that. I'll talk about that in a couple of slides, referring to the spring inundation of this wetland. Also spring pool for similar reasons. In more technical terms, very literal, the idea of a seasonally ponded, isolated wetland is very literal. In Massachusetts, wicked big puddles, which is basically what they look like when you're walking through the forest if you don't know any better. Down south, they may refer to them as hog wallows. And because they are often overlooked, they're often subject to disturbance, they may be considered the underdogs of the wetland world. And because they vanish for part of the year, because they do dry up in a typical year, and also because they are overlooked and often filled or drained, they also might be considered disappearing ponds. So what makes a woodland pool different from other wetland types? I just wanted to take a minute to talk about this. What I mean is, what characteristics of a woodland pool make it function differently than, say, a marsh or a beaver pond or a hardwood swamp or a bog lake or all the many other different kinds of wetlands we have. You know, why do some species of wildlife choose a woodland pond, say, for breeding, but not a marsh, for example? I think it's a common mistake to assume all wetlands are the same. There are actually key features that determine why they have different values and functions. And so let's look at a few characteristics that make woodland pools special. So first, what makes a woodland pool different is that they're small. They usually occur in a small depression or small basin, like you might be seeing, hopefully, if you have a picture of a snowy landscape in the forest with a pool in the center. When it sits in that little depression, it's almost like a little micro watershed with all of the surface water and snow melt from that surrounding upland area draining into and filling the pool. And they're small. They can be an acre or so in size, give or take, sometimes smaller, sometimes larger. They are in the forest. And so when you hear the term woodland pool kind of interchange with the vernal pool, it's because they're similar. I use woodland pool because I'm focusing specifically on a seasonal wetland that occurs in the forest. The connection to that forest is very important. You know, the leaves that fall from the surrounding trees into the pools serve as the bottom of a food web that's really integral to why pools are so productive and why they provide such important habitat. There's a group of forest amphibians that rely on these pools for breeding. And that more general term, vernal pool, it also refers to seasonally filled wetlands like in coastal scrub habitat or meadow habitat. So I'm kind of talking about a subset of this seasonal kind of wetland that's in the forest. So thus woodland pool. Another characteristic of woodland pools is that they're shallow. They're usually about 1 meter in depth, so say 3 feet, give or take, but they're pretty shallow. And they also lack an inlet or an outlet, so they're isolated, meaning they don't normally have a stream flowing in or out like you might see in a hardwood swamp, for example, or a marshy area. You know, if a marsh or a swamp, if a beaver comes along and dams a stream, it'll flood, and it really changes the dynamic of the hydrology of that wetland. With a vernal pool or a woodland pool, there typically is no stream flow. Maybe, you know, during high water events, there might be a little bit of a stream that flows out temporarily, but in general, they're very isolated. So by being so isolated and being shallow, the water that collects in the pool is really just coming from rainfall, snow melt, surface water runoff. In some cases, in some parts of the Northeast, there might be influence from a rising water table, but there isn't a steady stream flow. And so because they're shallow, because they're isolated, they have a cycle of holding water and then drying out. In this set of photos, it's actually interesting if you're a little detective and you know anything about woodland pools, you might notice the photo on the left of the more full pool. If you notice, the trees in the forest are actually starting to leaf off. So this is later in spring, compared to the photo on the right, which is earlier in spring. This is kind of just a fluke. This is the same pool. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but there's a boulder kind of in the back right of this image to kind of give you a sense of scale, comparing the two photos. What happened, the photo on the left is very typical. Early spring, the pool is full. The one on the right, this was just an unusually dry spring. And when me and a friend went out to this pool in March, it should have been really full. And instead, we found it quite dry. And like, again, it was an unseasonably dry spring. There were actually amphibian egg masses that must have been deposited when it was full, and then it receded after this period of dry weather. And we found the egg masses out in the leaves, and I'll show you pictures of those in a few slides. But it just gives you a sense of how these pools really expand in size and constrict really based on the surface water. There's no other supply of water in most cases. And so this temporary kind of abundance of water in the forest is really important for wildlife. It's very important for this group of amphibians that have adapted to breeding there. And the fact they don't hold water year round means that they don't support fish. And that's really one of the key characteristics that make these pools so important for a number of species. Because by being predator-free, by being fish-free anyway as a predator, it makes the pools excellent breeding habitat for amphibians, as well as invertebrate species like fingernail clams and aquatic insects. And they're also an important water source for other animals in the forest. Okay, so what else makes a woodland pool different? So I just touched on wildlife. So really the question can be, who else makes vernal pools or woodland pools different from other wetland types? Because often woodland pools are defined by who is breeding there. If I remember correctly, I think the state of Massachusetts has a woodland or vernal pool kind of certification program. And in some cases in New York State, where there's local municipalities who have created their own wetland protection, they'll often base the value or the presence of that woodland pool as an actual breeding habitat based on the species they see there. So let's take a minute and look at the key group of amphibians that are associated with woodland pools. So again, without fish predators to feed on the eggs, the tadpoles, the salamander larvae, these pools provide like nurseries. They're critical breeding habitat. And it's for this group of amphibians that live in the forest. So they're really forest animals. They just breed in woodland pools. And they're of conservation concerns throughout the Northeast. Oh no, that's not good. My computer wants to restart. Hold on, let's try to get rid of that. All right, well, that's a little distraction for me. My computer hopefully will not restart during the webinar. So in the estuary watershed for in the Hudson Valley, these species are primarily, and I'm going to start from the upper left and go clockwise, spotted salamander, marbled salamander, wood frog, and the Jefferson blue-spotted salamander complex, which is a hybrid of two species. One thing I'll note, I'm going to be talking really about spring or late winter amphibians. Same habitat, has very similar habitat needs, but unlike the others in this group, they breed in the fall. So I'm going to suspect that wood frog is the species that you might be most familiar with. You may have heard the males calling from woodland pools in the springtime, like luring females with their quacking-like sound. They actually sound like ducks. And you may also see them just hopping, in the forest, far away from a wetland or a woodland pool during the non-breeding season, during the day. The salamanders, on the other hand, are referred collectively as the mole salamander group because they spend most of their time underground, like a mole. They spend time in the burrows of small mammals, in tree root cavities, under rocks and rotting logs. And so they're not as easy to see as, say, a wood frog. And they're often hunkered down during the day, and they're mostly active at night. So the exception to that is the breeding season, when we actually have a chance to see these amazing amphibians. And, you know, around, I used to be able to say March, solidly March, but now really February, March, April, depending on where you live, these adult mole salamanders and wood frogs leave their winter shelters, kind of hunker down underground, under leaf litter, under rocks in the forest, where they've been all winter, and they migrate across land to the woodland pools for breeding. After courtship and breeding and egg laying, they then have to return to the forest. So I'll talk about this a little bit later when I spend some time thinking about conservation. But as you might already be thinking to yourself, you know, this movement between habitats requires what we call habitat connectivity, a connected landscape where wildlife can move safely between the different habitats that they use to live, to breed, to forage, and so forth. So let's now take a minute to just look at a couple of the species and their egg masses and their larvae and tadpoles. So, you know, that movement from forest to woodland pool and back, you know, this is also true for the juvenile frogs and salamanders as well, because when they develop and they're, you know, they finally have legs and they crawl out of these pools, they need to make the journey back to the forest. And, you know, first they need to survive the egg hatching and the development, and because while there are no fish, there are other predators, so they do have to survive first. But you know, they're going to need to also cross land to get out into the forest when they're developed. So here is a photo on the left of a spotted salamander egg mass, and this again is what I found laying in the leaves when that pool receded during a very dry spring. It was kind of left high and dry, but it was very visible. It's really actually a great image to be able to see those little developing embryos in each of those eggs in the salamander egg mass. And spotted salamander egg masses are usually kidney shaped, like you see here. They can be clear, and they are also sometimes almost opaque white, which both are normal. And later on in development, you may see that they start to take on a green color from algae that are colonizing the egg mass, which also is not harming them. And then these two smaller photos show salamander larvae, and I just wanted to share those because it takes some expertise to be able to learn to identify salamander species by their larvae, but you can at least tell them apart from frog tadpoles due to the external gills, which you see on either sides of their heads, these little fringy appendages, which enable them or help them to breathe by having those external gills. In contrast, as you'll see, the frog tadpoles, they have internal gills. So now to look at some photos of wood frogs and wood frog egg masses and tadpoles. This is an image of an adult wood frog kind of floating in a raft of egg masses. So wood frogs, unlike the salamanders, wood frogs lay their eggs all close together, resulting in what's called a raft with many egg masses all together. And on the right of the slide image, you can see there's a wood frog egg mass close up. And again, this was at that same pool, so this was out drying in the leaves, but you really can see each of those embryos really well. And then on the lower photos are some of the wood frog tadpoles later on in the season developing. And again, those gills are internal, so you can't see them. So those are two of our, you know, kind of key amphibian species. Like I said, there's about 5 species that use the woodland pools and really rely on them. But all of those eggs and tadpoles and larvae, when there are hundreds and thousands of them in a pool, although they're not being preyed upon by fish, you can imagine they're a very nutritious food source for other species, you know, like wading birds, snakes, turtles, for example, like this spotted turtle, which will stop over in a woodland pool for foraging. Woodland pools can be especially important for semi-aquatic turtles during their breeding season. So species also like Blanding's turtle, in addition to spotted turtle, A lot of them, when they leave their core wetlands where they live throughout the year to make overland movements to find mates, or for the females to lay eggs in upland dry areas, they rely on these pools. It's kind of like a hotel where they can seek shelter underwater. They can get food because it's plentiful with food, and the timing is right when there's all these eggs and larval salamanders and frog tadpoles developing. It's right around the time these turtles are moving across land. So this, the pool becomes part of the turtle habitat complex also. They're also really important for invertebrates, as I mentioned earlier. And I wanted to share just in particular this beautiful little fairy shrimp, which is a freshwater crustacean that's really dependent on the very intermittent nature of woodland pools. So their life history depends on it. They spend their entire lives in pools, and their eggs require a period of drying conditions and then freezing conditions before they can hatch. So they really need to be in a pool that dries up in order to survive. So they have a very interesting life history, and certainly well adapted to pool conditions. Okay, so what is a woodland pool? Just to review, so it's a seasonally flooded wetland in the forest. And typically, of course, whenever we try to characterize nature in black and white, it'll always throw something out at us that's different. But typically, there are small wetlands that's shallow, sitting in an isolated basin, dry in the summer. This photo of volunteers sitting on a log, those were folks that were helping to map habitats in their town. And we were walking through the forest and came upon this unusual clearing. And after looking around at some of the vegetation that was growing and scraping the leaves, we were able to see that it was actually a dry woodland pool. There was very dark leaf litter underneath the dry leaves, and found some fingernail clams. So they're definitely dry in summer, and because of that, they're free of fish. And all of those characteristics make woodland pools really great and critical habitat for breeding amphibians. Okay, so now I wanted to take a little time to focus on conservation, thinking about what do we do to make sure these woodland pools and the amphibians and other wildlife that rely on them are here for many years to come in the estuary watershed, in the Berkshires, and throughout the range. Around the world, it's very sad how many threats amphibians are facing, and many of them are outside of our direct sphere of influence as conservationists and volunteers and interested citizens. So I like to focus on some of the conservation concerns and challenges that we can actually try to address through our work. Habitat loss and degradation is, a major factor. Small wetlands and forests, at least in New York State, are relatively unprotected. There are no laws that just outright protect forests unless maybe they're a state park or preserve. And small wetlands in New York State anyway are usually too small to be protected by our state regulations, which regulate wetlands that are 12.4 acres or 5 hectares and larger. And their woodland pools are too isolated typically to be protected by the federal regulations that are enforced by the Army Corps of Engineers. There may be differences in Massachusetts, but at least in New York State, though, when I talk about kind of filling in the gaps of regulation, there are opportunities at the local level to try to protect some of these small, vulnerable wetlands. Climate change is another significant concern. Hopefully now you understand kind of the importance of that water cycle in these pools and the availability of water during the couple of months of development of these eggs. And so with the erratic weather that climate change has been bringing, intense storms, less snowpack than we've had in previous years, drought. I mean, when people talk to me about the amphibian migration the last 4 or 5 years, every year I feel like I'm scratching my head trying to characterize the craziness. There was Stella one year, this crazy storm that happened. We have had, 80 degrees in February followed by a snowstorm in March. It's just been really erratic. And the concern is that the hydro period needed, that period of water being in the pools needed for successful breeding, will be altered. And and we need to think proactively about what do we do to mitigate that. And then another issue is road mortality and habitat fragmentation that kind of severs the connections between forests and wetlands will force these migrating amphibians, when they move from one habitat to another, to cross roads and developed areas where they're vulnerable. So, you know, a number of things to think about. Let's talk for a moment about the road mortality piece to kind of help you visualize, if you're not familiar with the migration, what that might look like. So here's an image of an aerial photo with 3 pools, and I want to point out this is not to scale. Typically the salamanders are actually much smaller than their breeding pools. But the migration usually occurs on the first few rainy nights in late winter or early spring. Again, we always used to say it was a springtime migration. It's happening late winter more and more. But it's after the ground has thawed and evening temperatures are starting to, you know, stay above 40 degrees, at least 40 degrees. And so if we get that thawed ground and evening temperatures at least 40 degrees, once we get some rain, those are kind of the perfect conditions. And when they line up, there can be these explosive migrations like on the slide with hundreds and thousands of amphibians moving. And you may have heard the term big night to describe this. It's that idea that it's just this massive night of migration. Sometimes we get smaller, medium nights, but if there is a big night, that means a lot of amphibians are moving at once, and that local populations are then all very vulnerable at the same time to road mortality or to other risks as they move across land. And so that's the concern here. You know, thanks to conservation and stewardship efforts of state and municipal agencies, land trusts, landowners, you know, some migrations happen safely deep in the forest where the only threats may be some of the predators that happen to be in the forest. But in other you know, parts of the landscape where we have development, there's often roads that are severing habitat connections. And these small, slow-moving animals that are very cold, that have been basically frozen almost all winter, they start making these, you know, treks that are like the first major movements they've had in months. And when they encounter driveways, long driveways, roads on their way to the breeding pools, even in low trafficked areas, research has shown they can have significant mortality. So kind of contributing to this issue is that they travel significant distances. There's been research done in different states looking at the distance the different species migrate. I don't expect you to absorb everything on the slide, but just to give you an idea, you know, wood frog, this is from the book Vernal Pools by Elizabeth Coburn, this table on the left. Wood frogs can travel, you know, almost half of a mile away when they leave the pools and go back out into their forest habitat. Spotted salamander studies in Massachusetts showed movements of up to 300 feet. In Maine, those distances went up to, you know, 800 feet. So there's variability amongst the studies in the different states where they've been looked at. I think the take-home message here is that we're still learning, which is something we always have to remind ourselves about science. There's always more to learn about, especially about this group of species. And the other important point is that they do travel significant distances, and we need to consider that when siting new roads and driveways and construction, or we need to design conservation strategies that can mitigate these challenges of crossing roads. So let's think about the positive side. Let's some possible solutions to these kinds of issues. First, you know, education is hugely important. Many people don't know that these wicked big puddles in the woods are actually critical habitat for so many species. You know, if you read about woodland pools, they're often compared to like the coral reefs of the northeastern forests or the tropical rainforests of the northeastern forest because they are so rich for such a small area. And so, yeah, so I thank you for taking time tonight to learn more about this habitat type. And I also hope that you'll help spread the word by having conversations with your friends and your neighbors, your families, community leaders, other, you know, members of the BEAT network to help spread the word. But in terms of conservation, ideally the goal is really to conserve large forested areas with clusters of woodland pools. This will enable safe movement within that habitat complex we've been talking about. It'll also provide options of different pools with different conditions that might be important during, say, drought or other climate-related changes to some of the conditions of the pools in the forest. By having, other pools, even though they return to the pools that they actually hatched from, if that pool's not there, hopefully they would shift and go to another pool that might have a longer hydro period, for example. It'll also, by supporting, this large forest complex with multiple pools in it for these amphibians, it should also help then provide habitat for other wildlife that need large core forests, like interior breeding birds, for example. And so some of the ways we can accomplish this include coordinating our connectivity planning. So by having land trusts, working with municipalities, working with the states, working with landowners, and really getting folks to think beyond the borders and boundaries of our political or land or private land, kind of think that way of thinking about things all with their own boundaries, instead thinking about natural systems, crossing boundaries, and engaging partners in coordinating the ability to plan for good connectivity. There also can be work done at the local level with conservation maps, open space planning, local policies to protect these vulnerable habitats, and also engaging landowners and stewarding their land. Maybe, landowners don't know that much about the need to conserve not only woodland pools, but also forest. Protecting pools alone is not enough to protect this group of species, and that's often, I think, been the misunderstanding. We need forest also. And then also there's ways to design sites for new development in a way that can at least help to accommodate the needs of these species. And so by thinking about those solutions, we can really focus on some of the risk associated with habitat loss and degradation and climate change, and to a lesser extent, road mortality. And even though really we need to think about this large scale approach when thinking about habitat conservation and connectivity, there is the need to think about conservation of individual pools sometimes when you're planning a particular development project or you're planning an easement maybe for a local landowner. And so I wanted to make you aware that there is planning guidance for ensuring adequate forest habitat is left intact for woodland pool breeders. Since again, that's where they live, that's where they forage, it's where they overwinter throughout most of the year. So they really need that forest. So in 2002, guidance from the Metropolitan Conservation Alliance was developed, and it suggested that a 750-foot radius out from the pool, in that area, the forest could withstand about 25% development or non-forest habitat and still support the population of amphibians breeding in that pool in the center. More recently, guidance from Aram Calhoun from the University of Maine suggested maybe instead looking at directional buffers, like in this photo on the right, which would consider how this local population is traveling between the forest and the pool habitat, instead of just looking at a circle around the woodland pool. And this requires more study, whereas the circular buffer approach doesn't necessarily require study during the right time of year. So again, I think the take-home message here is that we are still learning, but we do know that without adequate forest, protection of woodland pools alone won't support these amphibians. And then to address the issue of road mortality, there's a number of things we can do. We can engage volunteer crossing guards, which I know Beat has been doing, and Aaliyah is going to talk about that. And once there is good documentation by volunteers over time about high mortality crossings, communities can then explore other options like temporary road closures, which, in New Hampshire, the Harris Center for Conservation, they were able to, after about a decade of volunteer observations on a particular road stretch in Keene, New Hampshire, they were able to make the case to the city to temporarily close that road during migration time each year, which is wonderful. And that's the kind of victory we all hope to achieve. And then there's also, if you really know that there's a hotspot of mortality because of migrating amphibians on a road, there's also the option to explore under road passage. And if I have this correct, I believe the under road tunnels on Henry Street in Amherst, Massachusetts, were the first of their kind in the United States of a under road tunnel designed specifically for salamanders. And I did go and see them a couple of years ago, and they're quite small, but I know now today, like in Vermont, I think it's in Moncton, Vermont, there's now a much bigger kind of passage for salamanders. But again, that idea that we're still learning and technology is improving with what we can do to kind of help these amphibians cross under roads successfully. So that's exciting. So yeah, as Elizabeth mentioned, to address this road mortality issue, as well as the education issue, the lack of awareness about habitat connectivity and woodland pools, back in 2009, I started the Amphibian Migrations and Road Crossings Project at the Estuary program, really with the idea to raise awareness, improve understanding of migrations, inform local conservation actions, and also mitigate road mortality. And so the volunteers in the program, they survey roads in the estuary watershed to find high-risk migration pathways. Again, we really hope that a lot of the amphibians are migrating in the woods and never have to cross a road. But the reality is, in a landscape that's as developed as parts of the Hudson Valley, many of them are encountering roads. And the volunteers also record weather and traffic conditions. They document the species they see, and they count the numbers that are alive and dead. And they also move the live amphibians across safely after they've documented them. And anybody, and when I say anyone in the estuary watershed can participate, because that's kind of the mandate for the program I work at. But of course, anybody can do this at any time, anywhere. But the resources that are available for folks in the estuary watershed, which anybody can look at, they're on the DEC website. We have volunteer training presentations on YouTube. We have a handbook. There's a video, Why Did the Amphibian Cross the Road, that introduces the program. We have a email list you can subscribe to get alerts about the migration. And most volunteers that participate in the program are self-taught. We've only held trainings 2 out of, I think, the 12 years of the program. And that's just due to capacity. When I had interns or AmeriCorps members, I was able to offer trainings, but otherwise, I'm not able to do that. So that's why we have so many online resources. But yeah, so many people go out with a friend or a spouse or a small group of other volunteers. But more recently, I've started partnering with different organizations to help them coordinate local volunteers for that watershed-wide program. And so closest to the Berkshires are our partners at Columbia Land Conservancy, who have organized volunteers and who also have co-sponsored our training and some presentations in the past. And yeah, and so at this point, I know that BEAT has also organized volunteers, so I was going to stop here so that Aaliyah could share information about those efforts. And I have my contact information up on the slide. I used to have a phone number, but since I'm not in the office these days, email is always better. But we'll have a chance to hopefully do questions, and I'm going to stop sharing so that Aaliyah can share his slides and we can hear more about the BEAT efforts on road mortality and migration volunteering.
Thanks so much, Laura. I'm just going to jump right in, Elizabeth. Yes.
Go for it, my friend.
Sharing screen, presenting. Can you see that? Thumbs up?
Looking good.
Thanks. So hi, everyone. I'm Aaliyah Domlino. I'm the stewardship manager at the Berkshire Environmental Action Team, also known as BEAT. Thanks, Laura, for that great presentation. I'd actually seen this presentation a couple months back, I think, at this point, and I decided, we had to have this at Green Drinks. The amphibian crossing guards is what we call it in Berkshire County, but there's a lot of different names. I think we've kind of flip-flopped over the years. Salamander Brigades is another one. But this is kind of what it looks like, that bottom left-hand photo. We go out at night, reflective vests, flashlights, it's dark, we see amphibians. So I'm just going to talk really briefly about our 3 transects. We've got one up in Williamstown on Pattison Road. This one and traditionally has been run by a couple of our volunteers. I'll say that I've never actually made it up to this transect, but this is a fun one, and you know, I think they're always looking for more volunteers up there, and I'd be happy to push people on to the folks that run that one up there. We also have one in West Stockbridge. This is right on the New York-Massachusetts line. That blue circle is usually where we park, and the red line on Cross Road is where we've got a pretty good migratory route. I've been running that one for, I think, 2 years now. And, you know, we go out probably 5-6 times every spring. And we see a lot. We see a lot of critters down there. Our oldest transect is in Great Barrington, and Elizabeth is primarily in charge of this one at this point.
It's Monterey, Aaliyah.
What's that?
It's Monterey.
Sorry, you're right. I always say Great Barrington.
Well, it helps with the PR, but I think we're far enough away from April right now that it's okay.
Okay, yeah, so Monterey, you're right. So we usually get a lot of volunteers for this one. This is a really fun one, and it's our oldest transect. I think it was Jane and Rennie that started it up. Before I was involved, so years ago. I'm not sure how many. Someone might be chatting me to tell me how many. Nope. Anyway, this is a great little transect to see tons and tons of critters. And just for, reference, here is a little table up at the top of one night out in Monterey. This was 2016. I just took a quick snap of one of our tables to give you an idea of what we saw on this one night, and the total number of amphibians. You can see they're both live and dead was 860. And this is, I forgot to look at the live versus dead count on this one. This was a brutal night. Must have been a Friday night or something like that. We usually get a lot more live ones. That was a bad choice. But anyways, we're always looking for volunteers. It's a great hands-on opportunity. We rarely get a hands-on opportunity with wildlife to help them out, but this is literally a hands-on opportunity to help them across the road, record species and numbers. And like Laura said, there's some great online resources for training. We can provide those. We have in the past run like miniature trainings, and we'd be happy to do that. I'll say the thing we're most in need of are new crossing sites, because we traditionally get a lot of volunteers for this, which is tremendous. But we're hoping to add a transect this spring somewhere in central Berkshire County. So I'm curious if anyone at Green Drinks has an idea for a transect, and I'd be happy to kind of troubleshoot with folks to figure out where a good site might be, and we could even get some volunteers to go out and scout those sites to see if the following year we could run a transect there and get some volunteers helping amphibians across the road. And with that, I think I'm all set. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you, Aaliyah.
Welcome.
I want to invite anyone who would like to unmute, and particularly if anyone has an idea for a Central Berkshire County transect, or if anyone has, Aaliyah, the definition of a transect for folks who don't know.
Oh, so I'm not sure if this is in the handbook or it's something that we just adopted over the years. It's basically just the route that we walk up and down late at night looking for counting and helping amphibians across the road. So it's just, the start point to the end point, and we walk it back and forth, usually when it's rainy, dark, and maybe not so warm.
It's very atmospheric, though.
Right. That's why I always say the volunteers for this program are a very special group of human beings, because it's cold, it's raining, you're often scrutinized by people driving by wondering why your car's got its hazards on, why you're in an orange vest, a flashlight in front of their house. But it's also a great educational opportunity. I've had fun when people drive by telling them what I'm doing, and oftentimes they've never heard about it before, and I keep fact sheets in my clipboard, and I hand them a fact sheet. And last year in the spring, it was so nice. I had a woman drive by. We chatted for a moment. On her ride back, she told me she had stopped to help some frogs cross the road. So that was really great. Like immediate gratification of impact right there.
I've had the same experience actually with Pamela, who's on the call right now, but she's hiding. She's muted and her video's off. Yeah, we had the same experience in Monterey. It was great. It's also very horrifying when you get in your car to leave.
Yeah, it really is. And so I'm so glad you have this chart up, because I really focused on the habitat and the conservation side of things and not the crossing experience. But it's really incredible that you will see a number of species on one night. I think the total for our project over the 12 years, I think there's been about 20 species that have been observed. And four-toed salamander is the one that I've been most delighted in, that it's considered the greatest conservation need, high priority in New York State. And I think it's in part because maybe, you know, biologists haven't been looking in the right places, but we get to see them on the roads. I mean, they're tiny, but once you get that search image for what they look for, volunteers are now seeing them, documenting them. And so I'm kind of hoping that if there was a researcher ever interested in studying four-toed salamanders, they could use the results of these crossings as a way to find where they are and find their habitat.
Elizabeth, do you want me to take off my screen, or you want me to just leave it up?
No, there's such a that one on the right is such a nice photo, so crisp.
Yeah.
I just have to say hi to everybody and thank you.
Hi, Pamela.
It's really nice to meet you. Hi. And yes, the fact that they were out there in the freezing rain, moving little critters across the road. You know, for years, I've grown up in the Berkshires, and I was driving along that Monterey Road, and it was a very, very beautiful thing, and it had a strong and lasting impact on me, you know? And so it was fun to pull over and, you know, get a few across the road and pull up a little further and get a few more across the road. And so thank you for all the work that you're all doing. And I'm going to shut it off again because I just got home.
That's all right. Thank you.
Nice to meet you. Bye.
Well, I want to invite anyone else who has a question or a thought or an experience to chime in. All right, well, yeah, Leah, you can stop screen sharing, and I'm going to screen share for 1 second.
It looks like Bob Shepard is waving his hand.
Oh, Bob, sorry. Go ahead, Bob.
Hi. I'm just wondering, has anybody done any research as to how these creatures know enough to go across a road? How do they know there's something on the other side?
Well, that's a good question.
I know the guy that definitely knows the answer to that one. Tom, you mind taking that? I mean, we might as well go right to the expert.
Excuse me, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yep.
The salamanders are incredibly concentrated in the pools that they were born in. And these animals live long periods of time, 15 to 20 to maybe even 30 years for spotted salamanders and probably Jeffersons as well. And they migrate back to the same pools they were born in for the most part. Young animals may disperse and find new vernal pools or go to other ones, but the vast majority go to the same spot year after year. Now, of course, sometimes, well, generations, these animals were going to they have to spend the winter up in the forests, and then they have to migrate to these pools. And historically, there were no roads, so they had no trouble getting there. The roads just are sort of after the fact. And as we've been talking about in this whole thing, road crossings are a big deal, and it's such a big deal that the tunnels that she mentioned earlier, I was lucky enough to get the first phone call from the Fauna and Flora Preservation Society in London saying they had such good success with toad tunnels. They wanted to open up something in America, and my boss at that time from Mass Audubon said, yeah, do it anywhere you want in the country as long as it's in Massachusetts. And they gave him my phone number. And so we were really fascinated by not only the salamanders coming across the roads and using those little initial tunnels, but the question really came up, and which is more fascinating to me, is how do they know where those vernal pools are? How do they navigate to these? And one night we were standing there in the middle of the night, and it sort of stopped raining. There was still snow and ice a little bit in the forest. And I stood in the middle of the road and looked up at the forest where the salamanders were coming from. I turned around to the wetland that they were heading to, and I looked back and forth. And it occurred to me that these vernal pools give off a luminescence, a glow at night, even in rain. And I'm wondering, in fact, if they are going to those. We used to mark the salamanders by attaching little tags to them as they were migrating, so we could make sure we could identify them easily. And every time we put our flashlight down to get out the tags, we would often find that the salamanders walked right into the flashlight. And so there's probably something with illumination that draws them to there. So the roads are just there. They have to cross them if we put a road in their way. And that's a long way around the story, but that's all I have.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
No,
Yeah,
no
and
problem.
it's sad, like you were talking about just how they keep returning. I used to monitor Blanding's turtles in Dutchess County, and there was one older female that kept trying to cross this one busy road, and because she was trying to go back to the same site she nested every year before all this development was there, and we would move her back, and the next day one of the technicians would have radio tracked her back to the same spot. It was really sad. And so it is hard to watch how wildlife have to try to adjust and adapt to this very concrete world we've developed.
Yeah, it's really tough. All this, really the division of landscapes isn't just for big animals. It's a lot of the little stuff that are backyards that really need attention. And Laura, that was a great presentation. I really appreciated it. A nice overview of the sort of the current state of affairs, and it's great that you guys in New York State a lot of this stuff.
Thank you. Well, I'm inspired. One of the conferences I started going to a few years back was the Northeast Transportation and Wildlife Conference. A lot of great examples, right, of what different communities and states are doing, and really has been inspiring to me to see how far ahead, even Canada, they're really doing a lot of great stuff to mitigate the road problem.
And just a little plug for that conference. It's virtual this year, and if you go on the Beat News, you can register. I think Donde / looks like Nick Russo had a question.
Yeah, that's me. Yeah, I'm looking at the MassGIS Oliver tool and just seeing what certified vernal pools are like in the Pittsfield area.
Nick's an engineer, he can't help himself.
What was that?
You're an engineer, you can't help yourself.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just wondering like the magic formula is like, there was that radius that certain species would travel between the forest and the pool, somewhere between like 750 and 2,000 feet, right? So should we try and find like a vernal pool that is within, say, like that distance of a main road, and that could end up being like a transect in Pittsfield or Central Berkshires that would be like a good candidate?
So I'll take this one if that's all right. So there's a couple other things to consider in Pittsfield, one of which is road traffic. So as much as I'd love to stop traffic on Route 7 in the middle of the night when the amphibians are crossing, it's just not quite safe to do so. So we're looking for not these main roads, not these main arteries, but kind of secondary or even tertiary roads where it's, we do have to consider our own safety at the same time as we consider, all these amphibians crossing. So that's definitely a consideration to take into account. I'll say, having had a number of scouting parties out looking for other transects, that oftentimes you find success when you have a small hillside or something like a bowl and all of it slopes down to the wetland or vernal pool. In that way, they'll kind of be funneled down to that vernal pool, and it's less likely that you'll have a vernal pool up on that hillside. So just a couple of, if you want to throw like a contour layer onto that MassGIS layer, you could come up with something interesting, and I'd be happy to help coordinate on that front. Sure. Yeah. This is just a quick exercise I was doing while I was listening, but yeah, it'd be interesting to go in more depth. Yeah. Let me know. Great. Thanks, Donde.
And I just shared a link to like a, 14-minute video that was part of our training series that offers ways to use different online mappers and just maps in general and air photos to try to find potential crossings.
And I've shared the link for registration, information, and also registration for the Northeastern Transportation Conference in the chat. I will send a follow-up email to everyone as well. Sorry, I was muted. I invite any last thoughts or questions.
Laura, can I break in for one quick question? And maybe I didn't hear it right correctly. In New York State, what did you say the distance was for protection of vernal pools?
No, there is no protection of vernal pools in New York State.
Really?
So in New York State, the Freshwater Wetlands Act protects wetlands that are 12.4 acres and larger, 5 hectares. Or there is a designation called unusually wetlands of unusual local importance, and that designation was used out on Long Island to protect tiger salamander habitat. But it's not been used very much unless there's a threatened or endangered species, unfortunately. So in New York State, you know, while people care about vernal pools, the way the regulation or the law is written, it only protects wetlands that are 5 hectares and larger. And then because of the federal regulations not protecting isolated wetlands, you know, now they're only really focused on wetlands that are connected to navigable waterways. That means the very reasons why they are what they are, small and isolated, are the reasons why they don't get protected by the state or federal regulations in New York State. Massachusetts might be different. But what I was saying is that, you know, in some cases, there's been local municipal wetland laws that have been adopted by towns or villages or cities to protect these small wetlands that are otherwise, you know, slipping through the regulatory cracks.
Sure. Yeah, I'm kind of surprised at that, but maybe that could be an area some folks in New York can get flying on, because we were lucky enough to get vernal pools as a special wetland protection 20 years ago. We passed our first Endangered Species Act. So this is good, and more should be done.
And there's been some bills proposed where, because there's been interest by some groups in expanding wetland protection in New York State. They just haven't gone anywhere.
Yeah. Well, keep working it.
Yes.
Well, I want to thank Laura for a wonderful presentation. I want to thank Aaliyah for stalwartly leading our crews of volunteers in the cold, damp, atmospheric spring nights, for converting me to the art and science of amphibian crossings. And I want to invite you all to join us for our next Green Drinks, which will be Tuesday, September 15th. We'll be talking about conservation. I invite you all to come. Laura, please join us if you can. And I think that is it for now. So thanks so much, everyone, and have a wonderful Tuesday evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great meeting you all.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you.